Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of the Comrade Cast. And today we are finally taking a step away from American politics. I know it's the election year, it's the big year for what's happening in America, but there hasn't been a lot going on. Campaigns just been chugging along. We did have the DNC, but I'm one of those people that I really don't care about the party conventions. It's a nice big, party for the party. But realistically, after the convention, there's typically a little bump or whatever in polls. But after that, everything that happened at the convention is virtually forgotten and things grind on as normal. That being said, it was a really good convention, one of the best conventions I've seen for the Democratic Party in a long time. Tons of energy, lots of great speeches. But again, moving forward into time, most people really aren't going to care. Instead, today, we are going to turn our focus back to Ukraine. There's obviously been a situation brewing there that I haven't talked about that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Ukraine's counteroffensive into Russia. We're going to see where we are, take stock of the map, talk about what Ukraine's objectives are, what potentially could happen as a result of this, and do a little bit of analysis there. And then I want to talk about what's happening in France. We talked about the snap French election, and essentially what's happening is that Macron is refusing to appoint a prime minister from the popular and winning left-wing coalition, and it has brought the entire French government to a grinding stop. All right, so let's start the show off here. We're going to start off at our deep state map, one of our starting off points. And one of the great things is that they've actually improved the interface. As we can see, they have a timer here, and we are going to watch this. We are going to watch this invasion into Kursk Oblast unfold before us in semi-real time here. So the invasion itself started on the 8th of August. So bam, Ukraine comes in, and then about 5 days later, they expand. Another 2 days later, they expand again. And then this has pretty much been, okay, so yeah, the white territory is unconfirmed / disputed territory that we're not 100% sure if this is Ukrainian, if this is Russian, but the blue is confirmed Ukrainian. So yeah, that's where we are now. Hasn't been any real movement here in about 10 days or so. Let's just give you guys a look-see here so you can see exactly where it is in terms of the geography. So you can see that they're invading just north of Sumy here. Sumy was one of the initial points of invasion by the Russian army. What you see here, this green overlay, this is the parts of Ukraine that Russia took in that initial thrust at the beginning of the war. So it used to be part of the front line, but now Ukrainians have opened up with an actual offensive into Russian territory. And I've got quite a lot to say about this. It's a very fascinating development. A lot of people are baffled, including me personally, but I do think that I have some solid, maybe ideas of what Ukraine is hoping to gain here, what the overall plan is. Moving along, there really hasn't been a whole ton of other movement in any of these other fronts. This was the Kharkiv front that Russia opened up. This was like a month or two ago. It's pretty much been stagnated. There's almost no movement here. Hasn't been any movement for quite some time. The main area of battle that I've been looking at is over here, right? Last time we talked, things were looking considerably better here. We were focused here on this village here, the village of Ocherenye. And this was like a key village for Ukraine to hold because, as you can see, there was a lot of rivers and other kind of natural defenses that they could hunker down. Last time we checked, this village was just breached by the Russians, and you could see that it has led to a lot of territory the Russians have claimed since then. This, like I said, this was a pretty key defensive position, and losing it has enabled the Russians to move in pretty quickly here and gain a lot of territory. But fortunately, it hasn't been a lot of strategically important territory, but they are getting close to some pretty important and big cities. It's definitely an area of concern. This offensive has been grinding away for a long time, and they haven't been able to really blunt it as effectively as they have a lot of the other Russian offensives. But I do think that the Kharkiv offensive, not the Kharkiv offensive, the Kursk offensive by Ukraine is linked into this. And then if we move down here, there's really not a lot of movement here in the south. The Russians have been holding in the south, hasn't been a lot going on. There have been some major attacks by Ukraine in terms of logistics. Of course, the Kerch Strait Bridge was attacked near the start of the war and now is effectively useless except for bringing in personnel. They can't bring any fuel. They can't bring any vehicles over the Kerch Strait Bridge right now. So they have to bring it overland through occupied territory, or what they had been using was rail ferries, and the last Russian rail ferry that they had was just destroyed by Ukraine. So there are a ton of logistical headaches for Russia in the south, but there hasn't been a lot of actual military movement. So let's move in and talk about our offensive here. So liberated right now, almost 1,000 square kilometers of territory. Although I guess this isn't necessarily liberated considering it's Russian territory, but we can have that debate. Regardless, this has definitely been a fascinating move by Ukraine. And personally, I've been thinking about this and I wanted to try and figure out what exactly is Ukraine trying to gain here. And honestly, I think the answer is multifaceted. When this incursion was first beginning, a lot of us thought that this was just going to be like another raid. And I know I've got some people who listen who aren't exactly military people. Just to clarify what exactly a raid is an offensive action against the enemy that is not necessarily to gain territory. It's to go into enemy territory, blow up some of their shit, maybe steal some of their stuff, take some guns back, take some prisoners back. And then once you've sufficiently done enough damage, you get right back to your home territory. An actual offensive to move into and gain and hold territory is a significantly more complicated military maneuver. And at first, I didn't think that Ukraine was going to go this way, but it's clear at this point that they have been here now for 20 days and doesn't seem like they're keen on going anywhere. What's the plan here? Well, at this point, I think there is going to be another counteroffensive to gain some more territory. I think a big part of this was to open up a new front that Ukraine could manage much more on its own terms and would also be devoid of a lot of the obstacles which held them back in last year's counteroffensive. I feel like this whole thing started when one of the Ukrainian generals was just rereading The Art of War or something like that. And there's a famous quote in The Art of War that's something like, the best place to attack is where the enemy won't expect you, or where your attack is going to be unexpected. I feel like somebody in the Ukraine general staff just read that quote and was like, oh shit, we should attack where they wouldn't expect us. Well, they're probably not going to expect us to invade Russia proper. There's the germination of the idea. But this is, in terms of military operation, a huge gamble, but I think it's a very smart risk. It's a calculated risk, and one which hopefully will pay off long term. But the thing here is, by opening up this new front, especially in an area that's devoid of trenches and tank traps and other fortified defenses, this allows Ukraine to lean into its military strengths much more. Its military strengths vis-a-vis Russia being right now more advanced gear that happens to be more mobile, and an emphasis on combined mobile warfare. And obviously you need some sort of room to maneuver in order for that to be an effective strategy. And this is why we saw it wasn't very effective in the counteroffensive in 2023, because there wasn't that room to maneuver. Russia had effectively shut down any field of maneuver by building these layers upon layers of defenses. Of course, there are still going to be defenses along the border, but nowhere near built up to what Russia was expecting when frankly, everyone was expecting the counteroffensive in the south. You're going to have, some defenses here, but if you're not expecting a massive attack, you're not going to invest all the time to build massive earthworks and entrenched emplacements and camps and supply depots and all that crap you need. In addition to that, the troops stationed here were by and large, at least from reports we've read from Ukrainian soldiers were effectively just conscripts who put down their weapons as soon as they saw the professional offensive forces of Ukraine coming. And that completely makes sense, because where are you going to put your most inexperienced and untrained people? Probably in a place where you don't expect there to be a lot of fighting, like just watching the border. Usually these inexperienced troops, they get tasked to get their feet wet with much more defensive-minded tasks. Guard this area, garrison this place, that kind of stuff. So it makes sense that the troops that Ukraine would encounter initially would not be enthusiastic to put up determined resistance, and Ukraine definitely exploited this very well, moving through into Russian territory, again, using those combined arms to bust through any type of defense or resistance they saw. One of the big things that has enabled Ukraine in this counteroffensive is that they finally have the F-16s that have been supplied to them. And again, one of the things that I hate so much about the discussion about supplying Ukraine with military arms, because I don't know if you guys saw the disastrous Breaking Point segment on the war in Ukraine, where everybody like universally panned them like, oh my God, they're invading Russia. How could they do that? Fucking war, guys. Their country is being invaded. You have a lot of people who clearly don't understand military history. They don't understand how the military industrial complex works and how the arms pipeline from the infancy of whatever equipment that you're making and how it gets into an actual soldier's hands. No conception of that. So these F-16s, did I say F-18s? Oh, I said F-18s, I'm sorry. But yeah, these F-16s that Ukraine have gotten are not actually American quote unquote planes. They are, of course, American built, but they belong to other NATO partners. I'm not 100% sure. I believe they're like Denmark and maybe Belgium and the Netherlands. I'm not 100% sure which NATO partner supplied the planes, but regardless, these were American weapons, but they were in operation for other armies, other NATO armies, and that it was these armies who supplied the weapons to Ukraine. It wasn't America itself. It was other countries that had these weapons already and are giving them to Ukraine. And the reason they couldn't do it beforehand was effectively because America gets to decide where its weapons are used in a lot of cases. And they were saying, Belgium, Netherlands, whatever, you don't have the right to give our weapons to Ukraine, right? You may own these weapons, but we are the ones who built it for you. We have the technology. We manufactured it. Don't go using it in this circumstance. But obviously the war has escalated over time to the point where now America is giving the green light to give these airplanes away. And we also talked about beforehand how you'll see a number reported in the media. It's 90 billion aid package to Ukraine. And you read that headline and you get like the impression that the government has just written a $90 billion blank check to Ukraine. Of course, this isn't what's happening. This is the total allocation of all the stuff that Ukraine is getting. Some of it is, of course, raw funds, but most of it is in terms of the valued estimation of the equipment that is being given over to Ukraine. This is equipment which, of course, already exists, has already been manufactured. It's not like they are building all these new things and then sending it to Ukraine. We'll probably, if the war continues to escalate, we'll get there eventually. But right now what's happening is America and other NATO militaries are giving away a lot of their older equipment, which was costing them in maintenance, maybe failing. And in some cases, a lot of rockets, artillery shells, and so on have expiration dates, especially a lot of these complex missile systems, right? They have expiration dates. And when that missile expires, it's no longer usable anymore. And you have to dispose of it in a environmentally safe way, a way that ends up costing a lot of money. So there's a lot of munitions and missiles and stuff that get sent to Ukraine that's going to expire anyway, that America or the native country would have to spend money to disable. In a lot of cases, it ends up being a real win for both partners. Again, not to go too deep into the hearts of iron metaphors, but if you're lend-leasing your America, playing as American Hearts of Iron, and you're lend-leasing to your allies, most of the time, you're not giving them your best and sophisticated manufactured equipment. You're giving them all the old crap that you're not using anyway. Sorry about getting off track. I know it's a rant I've had before, but it really does bother me. And it gives people, I've talked to people in real life, face to face, who have this misunderstanding and the skewed vision, and they get it because they're absorbing information that isn't in its proper context and isn't properly explained. So anyway, back to what I was saying. Ukraine used these breaks in the Russian lines, exploited them with their combined arms, and was able to grab a ton of territory, as we saw, under 1,000 square kilometers of territory. And of course, the question is, what are they going to do with it now? And I do think that they are going to use this new front, as I said, to allow them to exercise that more mobile-oriented warfare. But the thing is, in order to exercise that, they have to keep momentum going, and they have to find weak points that they continue to exploit and move forward. And that's why I think there is going to be some sort of follow-up, because just holding what they have now isn't going to do a whole lot. There's a couple different considerations for this offensive, and I think a couple different reasons for why Ukraine did this. One, like we just talked about, it's opening up a new front, which will be more conducive to their type of warfare. Second is to hopefully pull people away from the Eastern Front, from the Eastern momentum that Russia has gained. I think that there is a hope that you bust in here, you start taking actual Russian territory. Russia is going to have to respond in some manner, and the hope is that they're going to have to pull some troops that are currently on the offensive to move to a defensive posture. The third reason is I think that Ukraine still really wants to show, particularly the West and the Western allies, that they still got it. Don't count us out yet. We are still capable of doing some really amazing and incredible things. So, make sure you don't abandon us in this fight. As I mentioned before, Ukraine really needs a big kind of decisive win to take to the West and be like, look, we're still awesome. We're still worth fighting for. We're still worth defending. And I think that this offensive is a part of that for sure. And then the last reason that I think this offensive happened is because we are getting into the point where it's pretty likely that there isn't going to be some kind of massive collapse of the front line and breakthrough and overwhelming of the forces on one side or another. This war is going to end in two ways. It's going to end in the complete and total exhaustion of one side or the other after a brutal attritional battle, which could last years, decades even, or it's going to be decided at some sort of peace conference with a trading card type of proposal. Kind of like, we come together and okay, you give us Crimea and we'll give you Kursk back, or that type of thing. And in that kind of scenario, how you walk away is dependent, of course, on the cards that you're holding and how you're able to play those cards. I think that one of the things Ukraine is trying to do is gain another card. If they feel like, especially if there's a lot of pressure from the West to move into peace negotiations, Ukraine wants to come to that table with better cards than they have now. And if they come to that table with a piece of Russian territory, pretty good card, of course, depending on the amount of territory that they're able to take. Right now, well, of course, it looks like a lot. And, 1,000 square kilometers sounds like a lot. But the thing is, we're talking about Russia, the biggest country on the planet, a country which has a ton of territory, a ton of space. And the space that Ukraine has taken isn't exactly the most strategically relevant. So if they want to have that card to play at the table, they need to have a bigger piece of the pie than what they have now. So that's personally where I think this is headed, into some sort of larger Ukrainian offensive. Some of the speculation here is that maybe the Ukrainians might try and break down here and go into Belgorod, or move north, take Kursk, another important strategic hub for Russia. I think Kursk is definitely the more likely objective. I think Belgorod would definitely be a stretch. But that being said, I really do think they need to keep the pressure on and exploit what they have, because if they wait too long, they wait for the Russians to dig in, they wait for the Russians to build up, then they could be in a really precarious situation where now they're trying to defend territory that they hold, and they're surrounded by Russians on every side, who have the home field advantage, or however you want to put it. It could potentially turn south very quickly. That's only if the Ukrainians get bogged down. If they're able to keep up a lot of momentum then I think that they're going to be okay. And I think that is the overall goal. I think it is to take more than what they have now. Last thing I want to say here before we move on to our next segment is that I actually heard an interesting thesis recently, an interesting theory, that in response of this invasion into Russia from Ukraine, that Russia might finally, re-enable the Belarusian government to invade Ukraine from the north coming into Kiev. Let's just show you guys what I mean here. If you guys remember, this would be the second time that the Belarusians have allowed the Russians to move in and attack through their territory into Kiev. They had to run through Chernobyl, and then they all made it right to the outskirts of the capital before eventually being turned back. But there is a theory that in response to this invasion, that the Russians will be like, okay, Belarusia, now it's your time. You go in and you invade Ukraine. And you could justify it something like, well, Belarusians are worried that Ukraine is going to invade their territory now, so we're going to preemptively strike, or whatever they want to justify it. But I think it's definitely a very plausible scenario, a very plausible idea. The thing is that carries a ton of risks, mainly for Lukashenko, who is the president of Belarus. Carries a ton of risks for him. For Russia, not so much. They can basically just say, hey, buddy. Putin can say, hey, my buddy Lukashenko, remember all those favors that you owe me? Well, we're cashing them out. Get your boys up and at them. They're going to Ukraine. And then, of course, you have the invasion of Ukraine. And if it doesn't go well, a lot of Belarusians die. Lukashenko's position looks a lot more precarious because Lukashenko is not popular in Belarus. In fact, he's pretty much never been hugely popular. Virtually every election that he has had has been very fishy, very suspicious. So this guy has pretty much no popular support. He is backed by Putin and the powers of the Russian oligarchs because they let the Russians keep their thumb on the country. So I think it's definitely plausible that Putin could activate Belarus and say, get in there, guys. Now is your time, especially because, right, Ukraine is under a lot of stress. They're invading Russia. They're getting invaded by Russia. There's a lot of fighting going on over a huge swath of territory. And this could be the time where you bring in the Belarusians and it's there. You're bringing in a fresh batch of reinforcement into the battle. This could be the time where you activate your reserves and they can make a real impact. Or it could end in spectacular disaster. And like I said, a whole bunch of dead Belarusians and massive protests throughout the country, where one of Putin's key allies ends up in serious danger, possibly even overthrown. So just like everything here, it is a very high risk, high reward scenario. We'll see. But right now, as of recording, we actually have been seeing a buildup on the Belarusian border. The Belarusians are saying, oh, we're just doing war exercises, which I guess you could just fucking say whatever you want and just justify as doing war exercises. Just like shooting at somebody. Oh, stop it, please. What do you mean? I'm just doing war exercises, man. I'm just doing war exercises on you. Anyway, yeah, as I was saying, I do think it's definitely plausible. Would I put my money on it? Let's say plausible is 30% chance of that happening. Not impossible, but not likely. But with our Ukraine update out of the way, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about France. Going to be a shorter episode. In general, I think I like to keep the Comrade Cast in that 30-minute to 45-minute mark. Anyway, back to France, talking about France. And just a quick flashback here, in case you guys don't remember. Oh, big old picture of the French legislature. Anyway, if you guys don't remember, we had the snap legislative elections that Macron called earlier in the year after his party got its asses handed to it in the European parliamentary elections. In order to try and shore up support at home, he calls this snap legislative election. French elections are in 2 rounds, and it seemed like the far-right National Rally was going to surge to first place as they got first place in the initial round of voting. But then the second round came around and the left and the center got their act together and started withdrawing candidates in areas where there was a plurality of candidates rather than just a one-on-one scenario. And this ended up giving the largest share of seats to the newly formed left-wing National Popular Front, with the centrists in the middle and the rally ending up all the way in third place. So now that the Olympics are over, the task of trying to untangle this mess that is French politics has now fallen onto Macron's lap, and he is shitting the bed spectacularly. What is happening, effectively? Well, the left-wing coalition is saying that since we won the most amount of seats in this vote, we have the right to choose which prime minister we appoint. The thing is, though, whoever the prime minister of France is going to be has to be anointed by the legislature. So they got to get a majority vote in the legislature. None of the coalitions have a majority share. Someone's going to have to work together at some point to get a prime minister elected. And the left is saying, hey, we are the biggest bloc. We should have the right to choose a prime minister. And Macron's like, nah, no, you don't. I know you guys saved our bacon in this election, and we almost spectacularly lost and shat the bed and handed the country over to the far right. But in thanks for that, because we didn't get first place, we're not going to let you have a crack at this whole governing thing at all. We've decided that despite you winning the majority, well, we're not actually going to give you any power. And this has, of course, sent the left wing, both in France and in certain circles abroad, into a rage, right? It's very frustrating. Dude, like I said, basically saved your ass in this snap election, win the most amount of seats, win the most amount of support. And because you decide, I'm the president, so I'm not going to appoint your preferred prime minister. Obviously, the left wing is very upset about this. And what's great for the left in, I guess, a minor sense is that the New Popular Front is a coalition of a bunch of different parties. And there was starting to be a little bit of infighting within the parties in terms of who is going to represent us here and what our policy is going to be. But now that this has happened, all of that infighting has gone. Everyone's back together. Everybody's unified because they're so goddamn upset about what's happened. So let's read it. We got a quick article here from Le Monde, and we're going to read through it here and see what happens. This is an editorial, so it's obviously going to have some opinions, but it should give us a kind of cliff notes as to what's happening. France's unprecedented and dangerous political situation. By refusing to appoint the left-wing's coalition candidate as prime minister, the French president is stubbornly insisting on keeping control of the situation, despite the looming threat of deadlock just days before the start of a new school year. That's something I also forgot, is that the budget is coming up. There's like a deadline for the government to submit a budget, and there's no government, so obviously there's no budget, so it's just a big clusterfuck. 8 weeks after the snap elections triggered by the dissolution of the National Assembly, France finds itself in an unprecedented and dangerous political situation. Neither Macron's prolonged decision-making process during the Olympic Games to appoint a new prime minister, nor the political consultations he belatedly launched at the end of last week have helped to resolve the confusion. As a new school year begins, and just a few weeks before the presentation of the draft budget for 2025, the country is once again threatened with deadlock due to the president's stubborn determination to keep the lead for as long as possible, taking advantage of the relative weakness of those attempting to challenge him. In a press release from Élysée, I'm definitely sure that I massacred that. And let me tell you something I really noticed about French people in my life here, guys. French people really appreciate it when you just butcher their language, when you just take an axe and just hack it to bits. Anyway, in a press release on Monday, August 26, confirmed Macron's decision not to appoint a left-wing candidate from the New Popular Front. Macron's decision not to appoint the left-wing New Popular Front Alliance's candidate as prime minister. This decision spurned the left, which was relying on its first-place finish in the election, to assert its right to govern. The reaction from all parts of the left was strong and leveled with the offense in question. The president's jurisdiction for this decision is that other political groups consulted with would have quickly overthrown the new government. Okay. The hypothesis is plausible, right? Given the degree of animosity aroused by the radical left, La France Insoumise party, definitely, again, butchered that one. That's the France Unbound Party, which is the dominant faction of the New Popular Front, but also the opposition sparked by several measures of its policy platform. However, in the absence of any other obvious possibility, it would have been in the interest of democracy for the president to allow the experiment to unfold instead of trying to assert control at all costs in hope of preserving his policy for as long as possible. Even after it has long been outvoted, it is harmful to drag out an outgoing government, which acts as if no change had taken place at the ballot box. Macron's inability to clearly acknowledge the consequences of his defeat after the legislative elections, which for he alone is responsible, is a key factor in the current stalemate. By unilaterally deciding on June 9th to hold these risky elections at a time when the country was divided and his policy was criticized, the head of state was not only weakened by his camp, but also endangered the country by exacerbating divisions, fragmentation, and uncertainty with the risk of deadlock. However, he has never acted like the clear loser of this election, nor has he clearly accepted the principle of cohabitation, a term used in France when the president and prime minister come from opposing political camps. So this is something which has happened in French politics before. The rest of the responsibility lies within the political forces in the parliament. Those who claim to be ready to govern have had the summer to try and forge alliances beyond their own camps in an attempt to build a majority that would impose itself on the president. None of them saw fit to do so for fear of compromising themselves or out of lack of interest before the 2027 presidential election. 2027. Once again, Macron's attempt to build a coalition from the center-left and center-right has failed. Consequently, the prime minister he must appoint without delay may face considerable challenges from the get-go. So there you go. Quick little editorial about what's happening and about what Macron is doing, effectively refusing to accept what has happened. Maybe he's just going to hold another election. We'll see how that goes. And he'll just keep holding elections until he wins. He's going full El Presidente on this one. God damn, what a fucking weasel. And people wonder why the left wing has such an issue with liberals and neoliberals and so-called centrists. But what can you say? The French will be French, and French politics has always been clusterfuck and clearly will continue to be a clusterfuck for the foreseeable future.